Hello, and welcome to College Writing's Relevance in the Real World, Fact or Fiction, a moderated panel discussion brought to you by 5Cs Out Loud and the Pomona Student Union. The 5Cs Out Loud is a club dedicated to written creative expression. It was started by students who sought to create a safe space where creative writing enthusiasts could come together, write without the pressure of publication or deadlines, and find inspiration and encouragement from their peers. Through weekly meetings, they seek to engage the surrounding community and encourage both dialogue about and self-expression through writing. This event is part of April Out Loud, a month-long celebration of writing. For information about other events, please contact them at Christina Bajani, with 2 J's, at gmail.com. The Pomona Student Union is a student-run, nonpartisan organization dedicated to raising the level of open and honest dialogue on campus. Through panels, debates, and discussions, we aim to present multiple perspectives and challenge the assumptions of students, the community, and ourselves. For more information about upcoming events, please visit our website at psu.pomona.edu. Now, if you'd all take a moment to silence your cell phones, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Tonight, we are here to discuss college writing, college writers, and their relevance outside of academia. The central question we'll be exploring is about the writing that we learn to do in college. Are the skills that we learn here useful to us once we leave academia? To discuss this question, we have 4 speakers with extensive experience in writing, college reform, and literature. Please welcome Pam Bromley, M.G. Lord, Matthew Specktor, and Dale Stevens. Pam Bromley is Acting Director of College Writing and Assistant Professor of Politics and International Relations here at Pomona College. She received her BA in Political Science and Biology from Williams College and her MA and PhD in Politics from Princeton University, where she focused on international development organizations. Pam has taught at Pomona and overseen our writing center since 2008. M.G. Lord is a critic, journalist, and author of The Accidental Feminist. How Elizabeth Taylor raised our consciousness and we were too distracted by our beauty to notice. Her other books include Forever Barbie, the unauthorized biography of a real doll, and AstroTurf, The Private Life of Rocket Science, a family memoir of aerospace culture during the Cold War. Since 1995, she's been a frequent contributor to the New York Times Book Review and Arts and Leisure section. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Vogue, W, Discover, and Travel and Leisure. A graduate of Yale University, she teaches in the Master of Professional Writing program at the University of Southern California. She'll also be teaching this summer at the first annual Yale Writers Conference in New Haven. Matthew Specktor is senior editor of the newly launched Los Angeles Review of Books. His writing has appeared in Harper's, Open City, Black Clock, and the Paris Review Daily, among other publications. In addition to his work as an editor, critic, and reviewer, Specktor is the author of 3 books, including the novel American Dream Machine, forthcoming from Tin House. A former film executive, he is presently collaborating with James Franco on an adaptation of Steve Erickson's novel Zeroville. Finally, Dale J. Stevens is an educational futurist and speaker on issues facing Generation Y, speaking about learning, technology, and success. At 20, Dale leads Uncollege, because by his own words, we're paying too much for college and learning too little. In May 2011, Stevens was awarded a Field Fellowship, recognizing him as one of the top 24 entrepreneurs around the world under the age of 20. He's appeared on CNN, ABC, NPR, CBS, Fox, and TechCrunch. And his first book, Hacking Your Education, will be published in early 2013. Tonight's discussion will take the form of a moderated panel, with each speaker having 4 minutes to respond to 3 questions from myself, followed by questions from the audience. So without further ado, let's begin with tonight's first question. Is college writing really useful outside of specialized areas like academia? We'll begin with Pam Bromley.
I feel like I'm in such my best company. Also not used to speaking in a microphone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, from my perspective as the director of the Writing Center here at Pomona and someone who teaches writing here at the college, I really think that college writing is incredibly useful in the real world. And I think, alas, don't have that much research to back me up, but I think from my experience in the real world after college, and also that of my close friends, and also from students that I've followed as they graduated from Pomona, I feel like college writing skills actually transfer pretty well into the real world in a wide range of fields that you wouldn't kind of expect. And I actually think liberal arts grads are often sought after because they can write. And I know that that was one of the things that my parents told me when they really encouraged me to apply to liberal arts schools. They said, if you go, you'll learn how to write and think critically, right? And like, what more could you want in the world? And I think that was certainly true from my education. And something that I've seen Pomona students also go out in the world having learned how to write in their college classes and sort of applying that to the jobs that they're doing in the real world. And so like, I'll just give you a couple of examples of Pomona students, recent Pomona students who have told me what they have sort of learned from the writing that they've done in college and how that applies to the writing that they do in the rest of the world. So my first job when I graduated from college is I worked at a think tank, and I basically wrote drafts and edited papers, and of course my college writing background was incredibly helpful there. Some of the graduated writing fellows have had jobs working as an editor in New York, or a psych research lab in LA, or a government agency, or a Hollywood studio. So I think, and they all felt that what they learned at Pomona in their academic classes really helped them sort of be the person that people would turn to when they needed a memo drafted or a paper edited. So I think that's my first stab at that question.
Is it okay if I hold this thing? Because, I feel a lot more comfortable if I'm impersonating a lounge singer. Something about that rigidity makes me a little nervous. I learned a lot about writing in college because I never bothered to get one of those fraudulent MFA degrees. In my day, I feel like I should have a dowager hump. But in my day, in the early 1980s, when I left Yale, you were a failure if you had to get a graduate degree and you wanted to be a writer, because there were these things called newspapers and magazines. And if you were smart and capable, you got a job at a newspaper or magazine, and an editor, an actual professional editor, barked at you and abused you and taught you how to write. During my undergraduate years, I had a very weird career. I ended up doing what I thought I wanted to do when I was 20, and this did not prove to be what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I was the political cartoonist for the Yale Daily News, and again, this is really letting you know how old I am. I'm probably older than your parents. God, what? In any event, when I was an undergraduate, Gary Trudeau was still living in New Haven, and he was my mentor, and basically he helped. I ended up getting a job when I graduated from Yale. I got a job as the political cartoonist for Newsday, which was then the 9th largest newspaper in the country, and it was kind of a big deal. And it was all wonderful, except that by the time I was 32, I hated newspapers, politicians, cartooning, and I was really grateful that I didn't run away from Yale at age 20. Or actually, I'll go back. This is so, what I love about this, I want to know who out there is going to do this, like when I'm yapping too long. Okay, is it time? Tell me if it's time. Okay, now we'll just do that, and I promise I'll stop being a lounge singer. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a political cartoonist, and my father said, no way in hell are you going to art school. But deviously, I realized Yale has a first-rate art school. So I went to Yale, and I'm glad that I did, because it also has a first-rate history department, and I double majored in studio art and history. And I also had wonderful teachers who were professional writers, and I do think college costs too much, and if you want to be a writer and you're hemorrhaging money, you want to be a writer, and you're hemorrhaging money to people who are not writers, and you're trying to learn from them. This is not such a good business practice. I had the pleasure of working with Bill Zinsser. William Zinsser was then a regular contributor to the New Yorker and who taught a class, and John Hersey, who wrote a piece that you have probably read in one of your history classes if you still take history. He went to Hiroshima after the bomb dropped, and the New Yorker ran basically his entire book about what he saw at Hiroshima after the bomb dropped, focusing on the experiences of 6 individuals. And I learned, what I learned about writing from these real writers have helped me have helped me to read the front row from where I am, and to even at my advanced age try to form in my head a way to taper off gracefully from the rambling anecdote of an old person. You're up, Matthew.
When I was confronted with the question, do I think of college writing as useful, I immediately thought, define useful, and which actually is sort of part of my problem. I think, like anybody who would immediately go philosophical on a question like that, that shows how impractical I am, and that's a problem. I mean, that's that's probably why I'm a writer in the first place. I don't really think of writing as necessarily a useful pursuit. I mean, it's not really something that you do, or at least that I've ever been moved to do in order to get ahead. It was something I decided I wanted to do. Decided even feels like a slightly active verb for it. It was something that was like a sickness that I contracted when I was about 14 or 15, and I'd been a sort of dreamy, kid who read a lot and didn't really care a lot about television, was sort of shy, and so writing was something early that I decided to do, and I don't think I understood at that time. I didn't have a clue how impractical it was. I mean, I think I still sort of thought, well, I'll write a novel and that'll take care of my life, and needless to say, I wrote a novel. I failed to sell that novel. I wrote a second novel. I sold it for almost nothing, and I was like, I thought you wrote books and then you sold them and then they let you stay in a room and write. And the opposite of that is true. I mean, it remains a real impractical profession, which doesn't mean that I regret doing it. And I mean, on the contrary, it's my favorite thing. I mean, I think you can. It's sort of like deciding whether you would prefer to live, long or well. Not that those things are necessarily, opposed, but I write because it gives me more pleasure than anything else. I arrange my life in order to be able to keep doing it, and that's incredibly inconvenient. And I would say I did attend an MFA program, but I studied creative writing as an undergraduate with James Baldwin, who is certainly among the most real writers the last 50 or 75 years of American culture produced. He was a terrible teacher. And then I studied with some people that were not particularly great writers, but were great teachers. I never spent, I did my MFA very late. I did it when I was 40. And I did not spend, I spent a little of my own money, but not very much. I mean, the idea of if you're thinking of attending an MFA program, the first thing I would say is go, if you can, to one where they pay you, where you can get a fellowship and teaching and all that. Do not, I would really not recommend to anybody going to a place, I hear of people going to Columbia and walking out of an MFA program, $150,000 in debt, and that just seems insane to me. I mean, that seems irresponsible, criminal even. The question of paying too much for college, which is, I'm sure going to be addressed, that's a big one. I mean, as much as I've gotten out of my academic experiences, I didn't have to pay through the nose for them, and I'm thankful that I didn't, because I would probably feel very differently about them otherwise.
So, Mr. Specktor, would you argue that today, when college is more expensive, you could be just as successful as you are now without having attended, or was it necessary?
Well, it's hard to say whether, retroactively, it's very hard to determine whether your experience is necessary or not necessary. I believe there are other ways to do it. I also think that being articulate, learning how to write, does have application in other fields. I've worked in film and in different media capacities as an executive, and the people who can write, the people who are articulate and who are not sloppy, in the way that they present themselves, those are the people that I noticed. I mean, when I was a vice president at 20th Century Fox, people would come and they'd intern for me, or they'd come and they'd be assistants, and it made a huge difference whether they could write and whether they could engage with written texts and do that well. That was pretty much the first and most important way that I would judge them. If someone could really write, I would be like, wow, this person is worth promoting.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens?
I want to preface this conversation by saying that usually when I'm in debates, it's about college versus not college. And I want to make sure that this is not about writing versus not writing. I think writing is as important a skill as the rest of you do, and probably the most important skill that you could learn in college if you do choose to go. When I heard the question, I started thinking, why are we talking about college writing versus not college writing? Shouldn't those ideally be the same thing? And the problem to me seems to be that people in college don't learn how to write. Not that college writing is different, but that the writing of average college students is just bad. And I mean, there's, I certainly don't think that there's tremendous value in writing lengthy research reports that one person will only ever read and are often unreadable by the author themselves if you go to revisit it 10 years later. But I think the bigger challenge is actually learning how to write, period, whether you're in college or out of college. And I never really considered myself a good writer until I got to college and discovered that I was actually a pretty decent writer. And so I left school when I was in 6th grade, and instead of going to middle school and high school, was unschooled. So I went out and found mentors and built businesses and did internships. And I thought that I was a pretty good writer, but I figured that I was probably harsher on myself than someone else who was judging me would have been. So I got to college and I thought that I was doing A-level work. I figured that at college I'd probably be doing C-level work since I was surrounded by smart people who were all at the same level, and I'd have to work a lot harder than I would have before to get good grades. And I got my first paper back at college and got an A on it, and I went to the professor's office and I was like, can I do better than this? I mean, I'm here to learn, right? And he showed me the papers of the other students. And I was like, oh, I guess there's a reason I got an A. I mean, these papers were riddled, and this was a private school like Pomona called Hendrix. It's about 1,400 people. It's in Arkansas, and these papers were like run-on sentences and incomplete sentences in the first paragraph. I was shocked and appalled. And so I think the challenge is to learn how to write, period, not to learn how to write in an academic format. And I was lucky that I had a community of writers surrounding me growing up, and then so when I left college, I got a bunch of press attention, and then a good friend of mine was the former editor-in-chief of Nature Neuroscience, a highly academic writer, but she's one of the best writers I know and has greatly improved my own writing. She's the author of a best-selling popular neuroscience book and was very helpful in introducing to me to my agents, who I share with her now and helped me sell my book to Penguin. But I've learned immensely from her background as an academic writer. But her definition of writing is one that is concise and articulate and easy to read. She's not someone who values flowery statements. Yeah, exactly. I recently hired an assistant to work with me on the book, and the number one thing that I screened for was writing. I had people read a New York Times article and write a 500-word summary of it. And it was fascinating to see the different writing abilities of individuals. It made it really, really easy to pick out who I was going to work with.
Thank you. The next question that we'll be turning to relates to the work that we're doing as college students. Do you think that college students' writing can be taken seriously, and how is that going to happen? We'll begin with Professor
Not
Lewis.
just those run-on sentences like you were describing, the writing itself is a justification, don't you think, for taking it seriously? I mean, if it's written in something that resembles gibberish, I mean, how can you even pose that question? I'm confused.
I mean, I think the first step to taking writing seriously is to actually have it published instead of just turning it into your professors. And whether that means getting a group together and getting feedback on it, or publishing it to the world on a blog, or releasing a Kindle single, you have to get it out there and get feedback on it to become a better writer.
I guess my response would be to point out, not all college students are writing at the run-on sentence level, and I would.
Thankfully.
And I would actually make the claim that at Pomona College, some of us are quite good writers.
Ooh.
smackdown. I would say, I would actually
Literacy rate in the country.
want to qualify that response a little bit, because as much as I do think that it is important to publish your work, I think that there's this tremendous anxiety, understandably really, that comes on when you're writing. It's like, you start thinking, am I ever going to publish this? How do I publish? How do I publish? How do I publish? And I didn't publish. I didn't publish anything until I was 30, and I didn't publish my first book until I was 40. That was not entirely the way I wanted it to pan out, but nevertheless, I don't think it hurt. And I think in a lot of ways, it hurts less than publishing something you might later regret. And what I would say about getting people to take your work seriously is that the best road to that, it's certainly not the easiest, but it's the truest, I think, is to take your own writing seriously, by which I don't mean take yourself seriously in doing it. I mean, take it seriously enough to realize that it takes a lot of work to do well, and it takes a lot of reading. I sort of feel like the only way that anybody ever really, really, really learns to write is by reading a lot, and by reading not just things that are popular or things that are voguish, but in a lot of ways by reading the canon. By reading. For me, it's like, well, I learned to write by reading Henry James and Virginia Woolf, and when I was an undergrad, writers who were then contemporary, like Raymond Carver and Ann Beatty and Chekhov, reading forward and backward and as widely as humanly possible. That seems to me the single best piece of training you can have as a writer is to be, to be kind of obsessive about your reading.
John Hersey used to say, use models, because somebody has probably told a similar story well, and you can, and also it's helpful. Well, he said also, like, if you borrow heavily from Suetonius, nobody's probably going to call you on it.
I also want to say that question of writing a paper and getting an A and feeling like you didn't earn it. When I was in high school and in undergrad, I was a very for a long time I thought I was just a lazy student. That I spent a lot of time in high school writing papers on books I'd never read, and I'd get these fabulous grades on them, and I'd be like, great, I'm pulling it off. And I had an English teacher in 10th grade who, when I showed up, I had written a paper on Salinger or something, and I showed up the next day, and my name had been whited out and had been passed out to everybody in the room, and I sat down and I thought, this is going to be great. And he spent 45 minutes just demolishing it, sentence by sentence, and it was the most humiliating thing. And at the same time, I remember thinking, I was so angry, but then I also thought, oh, well, I guess I'm going to have to do the work. And that wound up being the teacher that was the most influential. The only teacher who really did anything for me in high school. And I think, I look at my various stations of my academic career, and I think, well, in every place that I went to, I feel like there were a bunch of teachers who were okay, and then one or two who were just life-changing. And you have to, which is just a way of saying that you're going to encounter a lot of people in your educational experience who aren't going to be all that useful or helpful to you. But you're going to encounter a couple who might be extremely helpful if you're not too defensive to respond to them the right way. Hopefully, you'll encounter those people.
Mr. Stevens, would you like to address the question?
What can I say? I think there's a tremendous value in making friends with writers, not in the sense that you want to go and talk about writing and talk about grammar with them, but just have friends who are writers, who are articulate, who you can converse with, who learn how to tell stories, who you can connect with on a personal, human level, not on a professional level. So I just turned in my first book to Penguin a week and a half ago for the first draft, and for the last maybe 6 months, I found that whenever I pick up a book, I don't actually read the content. I can only read the style. So I'll read books, but I can't tell you what books I've read in the last 6 months. I've read a lot of them, but I don't know what I read. I have absolutely no idea what the content was. I was looking at the style and the storytelling and where there were red herrings and where things were overlapped and all these sorts of stylistic things that I hope can make my book better. But in terms of, the content has gone completely through my head. I don't know if that's a similar experience that you guys have. Can you? Yeah.
Well, I found a really bad tick was when I was working on my memoir that I read, when I couldn't get into it, in order to keep pulling a history of the Jet Propulsion Lab back to my family, my editor kept wanting me to start each chapter with some kind of family anecdote, and I was reading a lot of Joan Didion at the time. So each thing, I mean, you can almost see the essay in Slouching Toward Bethlehem that my idea spun out of. I mean, they're my own stories, but they're her cadences. And I'm not proud of that.
Yeah, also I want to add, because that idea about writing being simple and clear seems to be a real culture-wide trope. You know, you pick up the New York Times or somebody and they're publishing Elmore Leonard's Rules of Writing and, never use adverbs and all this other stuff that seems like bullshit to me. Like people whose authority is, I think, necessarily limited. I mean, Elmore Leonard's an okay writer, but he's not really a very good one. I think that it's worth questioning a lot of the kind of precepts, the things that are in fashion at the moment. And there does seem to be just sort of a culture-wide thing. Get to the point, make it shorter. Why use 6 words when an emoticon will do? And it's like, that's really, I wouldn't put too much stock in whenever you see anybody espousing anything that has to do with, there is something to be said for clarity, but that's not always the same thing as simplicity. Hopefully the things that you're trying to convey to people in your private lives and in your professional lives will be a little bit more sophisticated than can always be nailed down with, Hemingway-like spareness.
I think there's also a lot of value in taking the time to define your own style guide. I know I've done this for myself and written out both like an editing checklist and like a checklist of things that I value as a writer. Not using adverbs happens to be one of them on my list, but there are lots of other things on that list I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I have to look about it.
That's your
right. Exactly. It's
aesthetic.
right.
Exactly
it's my aesthetic that I've taken the time to actually think out and define. I think that's something that everyone in this room could do and would be immensely valuable. Because often we don't take the time to actually think about what the aesthetic is that we want to convey as writers.
Yeah.
Ms. Bromley?
I'll just echo actually what a lot of people have already said. I will say that one way to sort of take your own writing seriously is to think about getting published, right? Whether or not it's a class blog or whether or not you're interested in publishing it in a different way. The library actually has just started up a 5C academic writing journal where people are submitting their academic writing, and I think that's kind of a great thing, right, to have your writing sort of be recognized in that way, right? And so I think publishing is one way to do it, but I would say, in terms of taking your own writing seriously, I agree, read and use others as models, regardless of your field, right? If you're writing a biology lab report, there's actually a lot to be said for looking at journal articles and seeing how it is that people are sort of constructing arguments there. If you're writing an art history paper, it's useful to look at articles in art history to sort of see what people are using there, and you can, sort of take, bits of knowledge, pieces of information that you glean from those articles, and bring them into your own writing. But I would say, I think at least in terms of academic writing, I think this is something that students and faculty actually need to sort of think about in terms of like thinking about student writing as something that is contributing to the wider scholarly debate and really sort of taking that seriously and being clear that your paper, though it may just be read by one person, is contributing to that broader debate, right? And that in fact, I think, for my students at least, one of the things that I think of as most important is if I read a paper and I have an insight about an argument or a problem that I didn't have before, then that's a great paper, right? And so because that student is contributing to the debate that we've talked about in class and helping me see it in a new way. And so I think taking your own writing seriously can help give your reader the opportunity to sort of see something in a new way. And so I think like thinking about your writing as contributing to that wider sort of academic debate is really important.
May I foment a little controversy? Just in terms of, I published from a very young age because I was really ambitious, and you know, when I was 21, I was a syndicated political cartoonist, but I wasn't really all that good. I was better 5 years later, and I've often been a little envious of people who didn't have to grow up in public. I also had, I know this is probably very hard for you to believe based on my decorum and propriety as a grown-up, but I was like a rabid dog with my politics when I was 21, and the median age of the editorial board was about 60, and I mean, I was not very political, and it occurred to me that I was envious of my friends who were in graduate school because it was a place where they could be rabid dogs and they could be hidden until they'd been socialized, you know, to function more in a work environment. Just being devil's advocate. I mean, you know, I can't say that I wasn't publishing and that I didn't get, but in a way it would have been better perhaps to have been hidden during those unfortunate years that still follow me.
I certainly do not feel like I am the best writer that there ever will be of me. I have no idea if I'm going to write anything else ever again, because I certainly didn't set out on this journey thinking I was going to write. It's something that I happen to be good at and is good for telling stories and communicating ideas, which is what I'm using it for now. But I have absolutely no idea whether or not there will be a system.
So actually you don't strike me as a rabid dog, which right there is a plus.
Okay. Thank you. Now we're going to turn to sort of the purpose of writing and its function in the broader world. And my question is, how should we be teaching writing to best prepare students for life after their formal schooling is over? And we'll begin with Matthew Specktor.
Oh, brother. I was hoping you were going to drop that one on somebody else first so I could give it some shape. Can you repeat the question? And then, no, I just want to.
How should we be teaching writing to best prepare students for life after their formal schooling is over?
Okay. I want to, go back for just a moment to my resistance to the idea of writing as a purely practical skill. I mean, it is a practical skill, in that, I think of, whoever it is that said, I write in order to find out what I think, and how I think. I mean, I think to myself, if I did not write, if I had never learned to write, I can only imagine what my mental and emotional and psychic and personal life would be like. I mean, writing, is pretty much something I did to save my life, and well, that might be a sort of dramatic or romantic way to put it. I still think the clarification that comes with knowing how to write is so fundamentally applicable to how one lives that you can't. It's massively practical so long as it's taught well and so long as it's taught seriously. And when I say seriously, I mean with a feel for its complexity and with a feel for its for it possibly being the only adequate response. And I mean, even when it doesn't feel adequate, it's sort of the baseline of any adequate response to the real world in general. I mean, look at what the alternatives are. I feel like every day we wake up and we're confronted by screens and televisions in which people seem to do nothing but shout at each other. I mean, basically that in panels like this one on TV programs, people just sit there and they howl at each other. And I think more and more that the denser the data stream and information stream that we're all looking at every day, the more writing seems to be more important than it ever was. I don't really. I mean, I think to myself, from an economic perspective, from a purely practical, perspective, whereby the idea is, how do I teach you to write so that you can make money at it? Sorry, I can't answer that one. I think anybody who pretends that they can is full of shit. But I think from a different and wider definition of the word practical, I think that just teaching it as an important end in itself is more than practical enough.
So you mentioned teaching writing well. Could you kind of draw out what that might look like?
Yeah, I can actually. I can say, not being
Without adverbs.
I'm not a huge user of adverbs myself, but I don't believe that. When teaching it well, I think has something to do with a feel for idiosyncrasy and a real attention to detail. I sort of think the closer the reading, the more intent. The best dialogues I've ever had about writing seem to focus on very, very small points. Sometimes it really just does come down to like a long argument about the placement of a comma, and as small as that sounds, it isn't small. It's what directs the flow of discourse, of speech, of hearing, of meaning across the board. So and I would say that it was pointed at earlier, that teaching writing well is not it's not prescriptive. It's not anybody who tells you that there's a single set of rules as opposed to a sort of set of I don't want to call them rules, guidelines or indications of what sounds good and what works.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens.
So I should qualify this by saying that I don't know how writing is taught now. To a large extent, I took one English course in college, which I got an A in, but I don't think that's exactly indicative of how English is being taught across the disciplines around the country. But one thing that I've noticed is that there aren't English courses on how to write things like emails, or how to write marketing copy, or how to write biographies, or how to make email introductions. All these sorts of really practical things that have nothing to do with academic writing, but you still use the same exact framework of how to tell stories, how to weave in different characters, so on and so forth, that are still extremely useful. I think one thing that college students can do is become a research apprentice to someone who's working on a book. I have one. I know lots of people who've become one. And it's an extremely valuable thing, and often those people go on to become writers themselves. One guy I interviewed for my book, Ryan Holiday, was Tucker Max's research apprentice. And Ryan's first book is coming out this summer. But he drops out of college. Not that you have to drop out of college to do this. If you have 8 hours of class a day, that still leaves plenty of time to do other things. You don't have to sleep. I don't. We're still young. Another great place to look for resources on learning how to write well is completely outside the classroom. There's a large conversation going on right now about the future of journalism at the intersection of technology and journalism. There's a great email group called Hacks Hackers that's curated by Jenny A. Lee, who used to work at the New York Times. She coined the term mandate, which is really active on Twitter, that has subgroups around the world that get together and host meetups that I encourage you to go to. The Knight Foundation and the Mozilla Foundation also run a program called the Knight Mozilla Fellows. They select 10 individuals every year and give them, I actually don't know how big the stipends are, I think it's $100,000 over 2 years, and then place those fellows into newsrooms. The application process is totally open. You go and submit ideas on the Knight Foundation's website and then have people vote on them. And then there are also meetups and conferences that get organized around these that are not widely publicized, but you will hear and find out about if you're involved in these communities. There was a conference at Stanford last year called the Moby Dick Project that was organized by Ben Ha, the CEO of the ICANN's Cheeseburger Networks. But it was an amazing collection of people in the room. We had the managing editor of the Washington Post, AP, New York Times, Dan Rosenbaum, like everybody in the room who was on that A list. And if you had been connected to the Hacks Hackers community, you would have been on the email list to find out about that. It was a completely open event. These are not things that are relegated to the boardrooms of corporate offices. Ms. Bromley?
This is such a hard question. I should say that I have, sort of thought about how to help students learn how to write since I started my teaching career. I'm a political scientist by training, and so I sort of lucked into my great job managing the Writing Center at Pomona, and I think it was really hard for me to feel like I had the skills to be able to teach people how to write. But in fact, as we've been sort of talking about already, every different discipline has certain things in common when we think about great writing. There's sort of a key issue that you want to explore. I think this idea of thinking about writing as a discrete skill, as something that you're never going to truly master but that you can get better at, is really important. And I think also sort of thinking about writing your way into knowledge. I was looking at a couple of blogs when I was thinking about this panel this evening, and I think writing your way into knowledge, that's exactly right. That you can't figure out what it is that you want to say until you write about it, or at least that's true for me. I can't figure out what I want to say about something that I've read a whole bunch of pieces on, and I have to sort of figure it out. And I think sort of telling students that that's something that they need to learn how to sort of deal with, that writing isn't a discrete skill like learning how to drive a car, but it is something that can be learned and taught. But that in a way you have to figure that out yourself, and that different disciplines have different rules, different expectations. But you can actually transition pretty easily between them. And I think one of the things that I really admire about the writing fellows in the Writing Center is that we have physics majors who can help people with English papers, and and English majors who can help with neuroscience lab reports, and that's a wonderful thing to be able to sort of see what counts as an interesting argument transfers, what counts as reasonable evidence that supports your point transfers. But I think thinking about writing as not a discrete skill that you're going to learn instantly, but that's something that's going to develop not just through your college career, but in the rest of your life. But that you can get better, and that you can think about, seek out those people who can help you become, the writer that you want to be.
I agree with that. I mean, I think of it a lot like being an athlete. One is constant. I mean, it's I am hopefully a good writer and have been one for some time. But it's also something that I feel like it's ongoing. My engagement with it and my effort to be better at it. My work as an editor at the LA Review of Books is incredibly instructive and rewarding. I mean, I feel like I spend a good chunk of every day kind of climbing around in the mechanics of other people's sentences, and sometimes in the work of writers who are themselves incredibly talented and more decorated than I am. Sometimes in the work of writers whose work is incredibly clumsy, and in both cases, it's like being I'll shift metaphors and say it's also a bit like being a mechanic. It's like just tinkering around and constantly adjusting the structure and shape of people's syntax and sentences is an amazing thing to do, and an incredibly satisfying thing to do.
I don't think there's anything demeaning about using the mechanic analogy. I think that's a good one. You want to build something that holds up, not a chair that falls apart when people sit in it. I just have to say that compared with political cartooning, writing is the apotheosis of practicality. Between me and my mortgage is writing. And I'm with Mr. Stevens on the whole idea of research and reporting, because when I discovered I didn't want to be a cartoonist, I had the skills from having been a journalist, and even at the Yale Daily News. And And when I suddenly had this huge book contract to write, what had been this apocryphal history of the Barbie doll, and I think one thing you can teach people to do with nonfiction writing is you have to teach them how to get information that is in someone else's head onto the screen of their computer. I mean, you can hunt for documents. You have to write nonfiction successfully. You have to be able to find out information that people don't want you to know. And there are many different strategies, but one of the most straightforward ones is simply being winsome and appearing stupid in interviews so that they trust you with things that are ultimately damning and that will, enhance the commercial value of your own work later on. You gotta have a good neck for this, befriend, betray, befriend, betray, befriend, betray. And that's something I think you can learn.
I think an even simpler way to do it is to just ask. So many times people don't even ask whether or not they can get something published or whether or not they can have information. One point that I wanted to add before we finish this off is that writing may not actually be the skill that we're looking to learn. It may be some other skill. My friend Nick Bilton, who's the lead tech reporter for the New York Times, likes to say that he's not a writer, he's a storyteller. And that's the common skill that goes throughout whatever he does. He started off college and before he was kicked out like 4 times. He was a graphic designer, and then he went back and started designing user interfaces, and then he went back and coached public speaking and did all these different things. But the common thread there is storytelling. And writing may be a manifestation of some other skill that you have. Maybe it's storytelling, maybe it's research, maybe it's something else.
Thank you. Briefly, would you like to say something to leave the audience with about themselves as writers or your experience with writing?
Any of us?
Any of us?
Yeah, I would just say that as I've been listening to the last couple of answers as well, I feel like the thing that keeps coming up is engage as a research assistant, engage as a in editorial work, be an intern. I mean, go engage with other writers. You mentioned the importance of friendships with other writers, and that's definitely true. I think I've spent a lifetime building up a set of friendships with other writers, and it's not networking. It's not trying to use them as stepping stones. It really just comes from having this common passion, and at the same time, those are people who excite me and influence my writing in all kinds of ways. And I think writers are can be a little naturally shy and awkward as a tribe, I guess, but for the most part, I think are pretty engageable. I like to think anyway that I consider part of my job as a writer, as an editor, to try and help other writers. That's the game. That's what you're in it for in some strange way. That's what I'm in it for.
Yeah, and don't let people dissuade you from. I love the idea of storytelling, and don't let people dissuade you from telling the stories you want to tell just because you don't have certain backgrounds. I got an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation science writing grant to do this book about the Jet Propulsion Laboratory because my father, who was not a great father, worked there. And it was challenging, I sat down and asked, questions appropriate to a 5th grader of the director of JP. I just became very comfortable with viewing myself as a moron in interview situations. But at the end of the day, I wrote a book that got really good reviews and that, was received respectfully by scientific publications. And again, I like the idea of coming at the storytelling in different ways, because my next project is not prose. I'm actually working on a graphic novel that takes place in the brain with Indre Viscontis, a neuroscientist, a UCLA neuroscientist. So don't be afraid to tell the stories you want to tell.
And I would say just don't be afraid to take risks, right? Like, you can always try. It might not work out, that's okay.
And don't let anyone convince you that you're less of a writer because you're not 40. This is something that I deal with on like a day-to-day basis. I'm 20, right? So I have people telling me all the time, oh, you're not experienced, oh, you're not qualified. And probably the biggest challenge I had with Penguin was not getting the book deal. Not convincing them that I was a good writer, but convincing them that I would actually write a book. That I actually had the perseverance to sit down and write 60 to 80,000 words. They weren't concerned about the writing quality. They were concerned about whether I was mature enough to actually follow through on that commitment.
And by the same token, don't let them say that you peaked at 40. Still some good books in older people.
The ages chosen were arbitrary, aside from my actual age.
So my collaborator is, in her early 30s.
And this can be difficult to do when we're in a college environment, particularly when the relationships between students and teachers are so structured, they're so formal. I keep being called Mr. Stevens, which I find entirely bizarre. I left school in 6th grade. I have refused to call any of my peers anything but their first name if they call me anything but my first name since then. And so, if you're going to go email someone like Tucker Max to ask to be his research assistant, don't call him Mr. Max. Like, Tucker's going to email you back and call you by your first name. Call him Tucker.
Okay, please join me in thanking our speakers. The floor is now open. If you have questions, raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can ask anything on your mind. Alex.
So this question goes to Matthew, who I was going to call Mr. Specktor. But you mentioned that writing helps you, that maybe kept you alive and helps you live well.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering, like, how would writing help someone live well?
Well, I think what I meant by that was something very, very specific, which is that Robert Frost once said called the poem a momentary stay against confusion. And that's true. I mean, I think in a lot of ways that when I'm writing something, when I'm engaged in writing something, I feel amazing, frankly. I feel delighted. And honestly, in ways that, I think, the athlete analogy might hold water here too. I mean, I have never been one of those people who feels about working out like, oh my God, I worked out because it brought me such joy. I do it because it's a chore, but that I must. And writing, I realize it's not that way for everybody. I mean, I think a lot of, on the contrary, I think for a lot of people, the process of writing is horrible. But I also think that's because they're not used to it. I think when you become reasonably good at it, and in a lot of ways my education as a writer involved, fooling myself into thinking I was better than I actually was, so I didn't get discouraged. I mean that's a weird thing. I mean, I think if you learn to do anything, if you learn to ski, if you learn to play baseball, like all these things that I've done in my life, and there are a lot of things that I've abandoned because I could just never get past the fact that I was bad at them. Obviously, for absolutely everything, you're going to be bad at it until somehow you get good at it. And it's how do you and it takes time, and sometimes takes a lot of time. But I remember deciding I wanted to be a writer when I was 14 and thinking that this meant that I already was a writer. And and then there was kind of a moment when I realized, I guess this means I have to write a lot, whether I like it or not. And then there was a period, it happened there was a moment when I was about 20 when I sat down to write a short story, and it just felt like I had no idea where this story was coming from. It was the most amazing thing. I just thought, wow, this isn't something that happened to me, but this is something that I feel completely in command of while I'm writing it. It was amazing. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, that happiness counts as living well. A couple nights ago, I had dinner with a friend of mine who's a corporate lawyer, and she said, you have the best life of anybody that I know. And I thought, you're the one making $850,000 a year, and I also thought, I'm also, I thought she really meant it, and I thought I'm probably the poorest person that she knows too, but I thought, yeah, maybe I am. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Yeah.
I'm going to call you Mr. Stephens. Sorry about that. But you said something about, you were talking about your book deal and how the biggest trouble was convincing Penguin that she would actually sit down and write something. And that kind of resonated with me because whenever I'm given something to write, I sit down literally like 30 minutes before the deadline and flash it out. And so my question was essentially, what's the value while learning to be a writer, of actually being told what to write, to be drilled, to be exercised, in a schoolroom or a classroom, as someone who's being given something to write and being said and being told, you have to write it this way, you have to make it good. Because sometimes I feel that learning or that instruction or actually being given that command can be helpful to your experience as growing as a writer, because you wouldn't get down to it otherwise.
I think there's absolutely zero value in being told what to do. None at all. And I even object to the use of the word teaching, because I think it's not about teaching someone how to write. I think it's about learning how to write. Right? I think there is value in having someone suggest perhaps different types of writing that you might want to try. But the science shows us that your motivation, your creativity, your engagement, your enjoyment is higher if you have choice in the matter. And I can show you the neuroscience behind that, if you like. It's also true that tight time constraints increase creativity, so it may be that you're imposing that on yourself because in that moment you're more creative because you have less time to do it. I've never been someone who procrastinates. I always set my own deadlines, and then usually wait until the last minute before those. But I set those a week or two before the actual deadline is, so I have time to put my writing away for a few days, not look at it, and then come back to it.
So this is directed at you, but it's open to all. How do you suggest learning how to write without using something or someone as a teacher, and viewing them as a source, or it as a source of teaching? So specifically to you, but also open to all.
So it takes a mindset shift to move away from thinking of someone as a teacher and thinking of someone as a friend. And when you do this, learning becomes reciprocal, right? So they have to learn from your writing, and you have to learn from their writing. And I can list off 5 or 6 people who were basically writing accountability buddies with me, who were far older than me and far more advanced. But we exchange writing and give each other feedback, and it helped me immensely in this process. One is Sandra Emmett, the former energy major in neuroscience that I mentioned. The other one was a lawyer, Diane Callis, Nick Bilton, Jenny Lee. But the shift from becoming a student of someone to an active learner is that the role of the teacher goes away, and you have to be willing to give feedback as well as to get it.
I was thinking when you asked that question, we were talking before we came up here. A couple of us were saying something about Jonathan Lethem, who teaches here, and I was thinking of him as someone who didn't have a writing teacher to speak of, who dropped out of his undergrad at Bennington and was not in the academic world when he was writing and publishing his first several novels at all. And I also think of Jonathan as probably the most dedicated and voracious reader I've ever met, certainly among my own peers. And thinking that I was wondering how he would respond to that question as someone who was clearly writing, on the one hand, with models. His book of essays, The Ecstasy of Influence, which is a really great collection about his own education as a writer, among many other things. It's a fantastic book, but he talks a lot about, he's very open in that book about what he was modeling his writing on, or how he was taking from this or that when he was writing some of his early books. In my own instance, I'm not sure, how conscious a lot of my absorption of my models were. I mean, I look at the books that I write, and I sort of see, oh my God, well, I I clearly learned to do this from Saul Bellow and that from Philip Roth and this from so and so. But, you know, and I always think, you know, and I remember vividly reading and loving those books and envying the hell out of them and thinking, how could I ever, you know, do this? And then those are the books I end up stealing from. But it's not deliberate. You know, it's harder for me to quite know, you know, how. I mean, I've never sat down and sort of said, well, I'm gonna use this book as my model, or this writer as my model. Even though I know people do that. I mean, there are many writers who do that kind of deliberately and successfully. They sort of think, well, I really love Graham Greene. Graham Greene's The End of the Affair is my favorite novel ever, and I'm going to read it 7 times. I'm going to take it apart. And I'm going to use it as a map for my book. That works for some people. I can't quite imagine trying to do it that way myself.
And if you're going to go about doing something like that, you have to be really clear about what the metrics are for self-evaluation, because you don't have someone who's going to give you a grade. You have to define those metrics yourself. You know, maybe it's making sure that you don't use any adverbs on any page. Maybe it's writing complaint letters and seeing what the biggest prize is that you can get from a company that you read a false complaint to. That's a thing that I've done, actually. It's just really fun. And a really great way to practice writing persuasive arguments. But whatever those metrics are, you have to clearly define them so that when you go out and evaluate yourself, you know what you're comparing yourself against.
That's a great answer, because it does remind me that limitations, that's kind of a loaded word, but I mean, you know, boundaries of a certain kind are incredibly helpful in organizing a piece of writing. I mean, I've come to realize that when I know how much time, what the dramatic time span of a book is, for instance, that's huge. Like if I think to myself, oh, this story is going to take place over the course of a week or a day, it lends a kind of compression that's incredibly helpful. And, you know, and I think you're in a way talking about the same thing, choosing a set of delimitations or boundaries that help you, you know, that organizes creativity, I think almost to remarkable
And then
degrees.
it means that you can check yourself against something.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you don't use the word teacher, you use the word editor. I mean, I think that makes it much more of a professional relationship, because an editor, in theory, is a collaborator, and you work together on making this project more accessible. You know, because sometimes what you think you're saying is not necessarily what you're saying. It helps to have a second set of eyes who is reliable. So I like to say that I edit my students, I don't teach them.
Yes. Also, having that, get back to that relationship with writers, I mean, it is really important to have people read your work, whether they're models or just kind of fellow enthusiasts. You know, speaking of Jonathan Lethem again, I mean, he basically edited this novel of mine, and I basically edited with him The Ecstasy of Influence as he was writing it. So, you know, and that's just, I have several people who, you know, not several, but a small handful of people who I consider like very reliable sources, and they're not necessarily people I always agree with. They're people, you know, sometimes I'll sort of think, you know, oh, I know that if Jonathan really loves something in a book that I'm writing, that means that it's either really working well or often that it's going to be a huge problem for everybody else and I'm going to have to take it out.
I would say too, I mean, I think one of the advantages of a college education actually is that you have someone who is assigning you not a specific assignment, right? Like a range of possible choices. And then someone who's automatically going to read your work, right? Like I think that that's one of the things, you know, now that I am sort of out in the academic world and I'm trying to write things for publication, it is a lovely thing to be able to have somebody read your work and just offer critique and not have it feel like it's a disaster somehow, right? Or that you failed in some way. And I feel like that's one of the real advantages actually of a college education, is that you by definition have a professor who's going to read your work, who's going to offer feedback, who's going to help you, you know, choose a paper topic, who's going to help you think about interesting sources that you might use, who's going to help you narrow down and focus in on in a way that that does sort of compress the topic that you're focusing in on. And so I think, you know, yes, I think some people can manage to do that themselves. I certainly couldn't have. And so for me, you know, I feel like that was one of the major things that I got out of my college education, also my graduate school education. It's just sort of like a built-in reader for the work that I was writing and built-in deadlines that I had to meet, which was really useful for me.
I'm still awed by the idea that people write without fear and a deadline.
Agreed.
One comment in response to that is that when I got to college, I was really surprised by how little work it took, and it took me a couple weeks to realize that was because 2/3 of my job had been eliminated. Suddenly, I just had to do the work. I didn't have to assign it to myself, and I didn't have to evaluate it. But those two parts of the work, I think, were arguably the most valuable, rather than just having to do the work itself. And it's really, really hard to come up with writing assignments. It's really, really hard to evaluate writing. But those make you an infinitely better writer, I think.
I would agree with that, and I think one of the things that that faculty can do, and certainly something that I do in my classes, is I really give like super open prompts. You know, like basically whatever we've been looking at, like pick something. And I had a senior who's in my spring class say to me, I can't, you know, what am I supposed to do? And I was like, well, you need to come up with an interesting puzzle or question that you're interested in, and then figure it out. And then he finally figured it out, and he basically said exactly what you said, which is like, wow, that's like half the work. And I said, yeah, that's half the work, but aren't you excited about the topic you chose? And I would agree with that, and I would actually really encourage faculty to do that, because I do think that it's really important to figure out the question that you're interested in. Also, better writing will come from that if you're engaged and excited about it. And I think, you know, peer review is something that people malign from high school, but I would say, you know, exchanging with your fellow Pomona students is going to be a lot better than it was in high school, and that you can really appreciate having others evaluate your writing and evaluating others' writing, and certainly that's something that I do a lot now, is look at other people's work, and then I recognize things in my own writing that could be fixed in the same way that theirs needs to be fixed, right? And somehow, like, seeing it in a different format helped me figure that out.
What do you, it's a question for anyone, what do you think is the value of an education in writing to someone in a STEM field or highly technical field?
Communication.
You gotta get those grants, and chances are the people, you know, who are handing out the dough are gonna want words.
I often find that some of the best writers I know come from extremely technical backgrounds, because they view writing as a science, and they count how many adverbs they have on a page and where the commas are placed, and are actually much better writers because of that.
I would agree. And I would say, too, you know, from my experience with Pomona graduate students who go off to work in STEM fields, that they actually often sort of almost automatically become the person in their lab who writes the papers, or at least does the first draft of the papers, who writes the grant proposals, because they've learned through their courses here to communicate their findings, and that's incredibly important, particularly I think in STEM fields when you are having to write grants and communicate your results to other people.
And beyond writing grants, it means that you can go and give talks and share your findings and results and go to interesting places.
Yeah. Yes.
We'll start a second.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and I took a creative writing class with Professor Lethal last semester, and it's interesting, some of the ideas you're talking about, when he talked about finding a group of writers, having editors, having your ideal readers, and my friend Kevin over there, who probably thought I was going to put him off the second I started talking, is also an intern at LA Review of Books, but I wasn't sure if you knew him or whatever.
No. Hey.
We do a thing Thursday after we get out of class with two other writers. We get together and workshop. And I guess the actual question is, the way we do it, we're talking about evaluating and assignments being half of the 2/3 of the work. After workshopping everybody's pieces every week, we give obstructions or suggestions, things. Basically, we give everyone either an assignment based on what they've done and what they're trying to do, or an evaluative thing. So this is for everybody. Could I get one or the other from somebody, and as it ends you more? I was wondering if you could do one as a lounge lizard and one as a rabbit dog.
Oh, the lounge lizard, what?
Either just like an exercise or a way of evaluating the writing. Something that, and that's for everybody, but specifically I was wondering if that could be an assignment for you. To do it from the 2%.
at this very moment, or over time. I'm trying to become more languid. And the lounge role requires a certain languidity. I think the rabid dog concept is not useful in that context. Although, again, going back to fear and a deadline, I found that that not in writing workshops, but in experiences with brutally sadistic editors at major American newspapers, the trauma of being yelled at by these beasts, when I myself was not the rabid dog, but rather, the victim of a highly entitled adult male rabid dog. Those scars have also made an impression on me as a writer.
Yeah, the rabid dog model, which is,
It's not a good model.
But one encounters it. I mean, you describe that as editors, and of course, all I think about is my adventures in the movie business, which involve people screaming and kind of abusing people. I mean, there is a way that if you are a writer, you will ultimately your writing will ultimately be exposed to hostile forces.
Well, now that newspapers aren't important anymore, I suspect editors yell less, whereas there's still money in the movie business, so they're allowed to yell.
I would say, I'm an editor, and I've never yelled at anyone in an academic, in an editorial connection. I've certainly, yelled at the dining room table when I'm trying to edit somebody's incredibly messed up syntax, but I don't, I don't find abuse a particularly helpful model. I'm also trying to sort of understand the structure of the question a little bit.
Basically, the end was for everyone to
My take is that
give an assignment
for your group, right?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, why don't you talk to them after the panel? You can kind of patch that up.
I mean, okay.
Yeah.
You don't think that's productive?
What? I think my main advice would be the rabid dog thing is to be avoided at all costs. Don't they have inoculations for that? Don't you have to inoculate your animals? I think maybe inoculate your colleagues in your writing group.
I would say that it's an interesting set of positives. You mentioned that the idea of a rabid dog at one end of the spectrum and a lounge lizard at the other. I mean, obviously you can't write by being purely relaxed. There's a tension that's inherent in the act. And as far as I'm concerned, the act of telling a story or the act of writing anything interesting, when I'm engaged in a piece of work, it always seems to be about modulating tone, about moving from a kind of extreme informality to stuff that's more aggressive, more tense, more. I feel like any good writing, all interesting writing, all writing that's engaging involves some form of tonal variation of tone and tempo. There's always a sense, if I'm writing a story, of even within a scene, it's like there'll be an exchange of dialogue, something that advances the story dramatically, and then there seems to be a need to kind of relax it and kind of give a beat of description. Like there's a real kind of ventricular sense that stories move out and then they move forward, which is a way of kind of deploying that metaphor differently, right? You kind of relax as a lounge lizard and then you attack like a rabid dog. You kind of have to be both.
I think it's indicative that you're talking to a panel of writers when none of them actually managed to answer the question, but got caught up in the language that you used to describe the question. I do have answers for you, and I will give them to you afterwards.
Okay. We have time for about one more question. Jeff?
So, Professor Bromley is my boss at the Writing Center. I'm also a student at Moore College. And I was thinking about what you, Professor Bromley, said about writing being not being a discrete skill, something you just sort of learn in one piece and then move on. And I agree with that point, but I also would point to the observation that there are writing skills that you learn in college. You learn forms, you learn routines, you learn rules, you learn strategies for making a good argument, for making what your professors will recognize as a good argument. And I was wondering about taking those fairly specific, discrete and certain set of skills and bringing them into real world and postgraduate writing. Do you have to unlearn some of what you learned in college about writing in order to write in a non-academic context, or can you take those skills and add other skills on top of them and use them?
It's a really good question, which is not surprising. Of course, asking someone who is in academia about what it is for people to move outside of academia is challenging. I spent some time in the real world, but I do think actually that all the things that you point out, right, like sort of the argument that is engaging and interesting, the form that you put it in, the way that you sort of contain it, it worked for me when I was working in the real world. I would also say too, that the friends that I've had and Pomona grads who have gone into non-academic fields, I think mostly say that they, they take, bits and pieces of the strategies that they learn for writing, depending on the nature of their job, right? So if they're going to be a foreign service officer and they're going to be writing a memo, they're going to be learning, it's going to be a different form for them, and so they're going to have to learn how to figure out how to do that, and then they'll bring in the pieces of writing that they were, bits and pieces of the writing skills that they learned. But the overall framework, the overall sort of, writing your way into knowledge, the overall sort of figuring out what you're trying to say, and communicating it in a clear and concise way, I think that transfers.
I'm going to do my best to follow my practice of not answering the question, but suggesting that you seek out Jeff Dyer's. I like Michael Fried, the art historian, a great deal, but for a brutal satire of scholarly writing, check out Jeff Dyer's review of Michael Fried's most recent book in the New York Times Book Review. It was devastating.
No, go ahead.
I think that what a statement that you made in your question is indicative of the mindset shift that's required. And you said learning how to write for what your professor's like, and that's not learning how to write, that's learning how to get good grades. And learning how to write in the real world is defining what good writing is for you, not how to get good grades from your professors.
I just want to tag what I was going to tag a second ago, which is MG mentioned Jeff Dyer, and I was going to say that he's a good model in general, and one of his books, which is one of my favorite books about writing and not writing, a book about a sort of hilarious and very true book about procrastination and writer's block, and kind of how your aim as a writer can actually obstruct what you ultimately end up doing. There's a wonderful book of his called Out of Sheer Rage, which is sort of about he had it in mind that he was going to write this book about D.H. Lawrence, and it just turns into this absolutely insane, really hilarious, kind of very English book about his utter failure to do it. He's kind of hauling himself from Santa Fe to Italy thinking, well, when I get there, I'll finally be able to start the book, and he ends up writing about everything else. And on the one hand, it's this kind of great comic performance, and on the other hand, it's as a friend of mine described it, a book about why not to commit suicide, which is handy. So
after that review, Michael Fried will probably be searching for reasons not to commit suicide.
I would say too, actually just sort of thinking about your audience and just sort of like taking what you've learned about writing for whatever your audience is in college, like you just transfer that. That's a skill and a strategy that you can move into other things in the world depending on who you're writing for, right? Like if you're thinking about what that audience, your professor, is demanding, then that's one thing, and then you can, when you're thinking about other audiences, you can sort of think about it in new ways, right?
Please join me once more in welcoming